The rain came for 9 days without stopping. It started as the kind of steady autumn drizzle that farmers welcomed, the sort that settled into dry soil and stayed there, quiet and useful. But it did not stop. It deepened into something heavier, something relentless. And by the fourth day, the creek at the edge of the property had climbed its banks and was spreading slow and wide across the low pasture behind the old barn. She watched it from the kitchen window each morning with her coffee going cold in her hands. The pasture had never been much to brag about. The soil there ran thin over a shelf of clay that sat maybe 14 inches down, which meant water pooled instead of sinking. And in wet years, the grass came up pale and sparse. Her father had grazed a few cattle on it in better times, but the herd had been sold off the previous spring when the debts got too heavy to carry. The pasture had been sitting empty since then, just weeds and old hoof prints hardening in the summer heat. Now it was gone entirely. By the 9th day of rain, the whole lower half of the property had become a shallow brown lake. It stretched nearly 3 acres, maybe a little more. Not deep enough to swim in, but deep enough that you could not see the grass beneath it anywhere. The fence posts stood up to their second rails in muddy water. The old cattle gate was half submerged. The rain finally stopped on a Thursday. Her nearest neighbor came by that same afternoon, standing at the top of the rise with his boots muddy and his hat pushed back on his head, looking down at the flooded field the way a man looks at something he has already written off as a total loss. He shook his head slowly, said she ought to call the county drainage office first thing in the morning, said the longer that water sat, the more it was going to damage the soil underneath, said he had seen flooded pastures sour up and go nearly useless for 3 or 4 years after something like this. She thanked him and said she would think about it. He gave her the kind of look that meant he did not think much of that answer. Word moved through the small community the way it always did, quick and certain. By that weekend, it seemed like everyone along the county road had an opinion about the flooded pasture. The feed store owner mentioned it when she came in for a small bag of grain. 2 women at the church mentioned it after the Sunday service, their voices low and sympathetic, the way people speak when they have already decided something cannot be helped. She listened to all of it. She nodded at the right moments. She did not argue or explain herself, but she had noticed something in those 9 days of rain that none of them had thought to notice. The water was not draining the way it should have been. It was staying, and she had begun to wonder why. She walked the edges of the water every morning that week, her boots sinking into the soft rim where the pasture grass gave way to mud. She was looking at the ground the way her grandmother had taught her to look at it, not just at the surface, but at what the surface was telling her. The water had a stillness to it that puzzled her. After heavy rains, water moved. It pushed toward the low places, found the creek beds and the ditches, and eventually it left. But this water was not leaving. It was sitting calm and level, hardly dropping an inch between one morning and the next. She crouched down near the eastern edge and pressed her fingers into the mud below the waterline. It was dense, heavier than the soil she turned in the garden, heavier than the hillside dirt she had moved when she first dug out the root cellar. She pulled up a thick, dark handful and let it sit in her palm. It was clay, deep, tight, blue-gray clay sitting just below the topsoil, and it was holding that water like a bowl holds water. She had heard about this kind of land. Her grandmother had mentioned it once when talking about a farm 2 counties over, a place people had called drowned ground for a generation before someone finally figured out what it actually was: clay bottom land. Land that collected and kept water because the earth beneath it would not let the water go. Most people saw that as a problem. She sat back on her heels and thought about it differently. She did not share this thought with anyone right away. She had learned, in the way that quiet people learn things, that an idea spoken too early gets argued to death before it ever has a chance to live. So she kept it to herself and kept walking the edge of that still water, watching it. What she noticed over the following days was that the water was not turning brown or stagnant. There were small insects moving at the surface, the kind that meant oxygen was present. There were frogs that had appeared from somewhere, sitting at the grassy edges with a calm and settled look, as if they had always planned to be there. The pasture grass beneath the shallow water was still faintly green where the light came through. The whole thing had a strange, quiet vitality to it. She started going to the county library on the days she could spare the walk. She asked the woman at the desk for anything about ponds, about clay soil, about water management on small farms. The woman brought her a stack of old agricultural bulletins, the kind printed on rough paper with plain black diagrams, and she sat at the long wooden table and read them slowly, going back over the parts she did not understand and reading them again. She was not a learned woman, but she was a careful one, and the more she read, the more certain she became that the flooded pasture was not a disaster waiting to be fixed. It was something waiting to be understood. She brought the bulletins home, folded inside her coat to keep them dry from the evening mist. She spread them on the kitchen table and read by lamplight until her eyes grew tired, tracing the diagrams with one finger. There were pages about natural pond formation, about clay subsoil acting as a liner, about the way water finds its own level and stays when the ground beneath it refuses to drain. She had not known the proper words for what she had already seen with her own eyes, but the words confirmed it. The flooded pasture was not sitting on gravel or loose earth. It was sitting on a thick shelf of gray clay that her shovel had hit 2 seasons back when she was trying to plant a fence post. She had cursed that clay then. Now she read about it with something close to reverence. She began to walk the edges of the water differently after that. Not in the distracted, worried way she had before, watching for the flood to spread or to sour. She walked slowly, observantly, the way she had learned to walk a fence line looking for weak spots. She noticed where the depth seemed consistent and where it shallowed out near the eastern slope. She noticed that the clearest water gathered toward the center, away from the field runoff. She picked up a handful of the submerged soil at the edge and pressed it between her fingers. It held its shape. It had weight to it. It was not the loose, sick mud she had feared. The thought that had been forming in the back of her mind since she first read the word aquaculture in one of the bulletins was getting harder to dismiss. The bulletin had been written for larger operations, for farmers with more resources than she had. But buried in 2 plain paragraphs near the end was a note about small-scale pond stocking, about how even a shallow flood pond of modest size, if it held clean water and had a clay base, could support a population of fish through a single season. The note mentioned channel catfish and bluegill as hardy choices. It mentioned a starting number of fingerlings. It mentioned cost in a way that made her do the arithmetic twice on the back of an envelope. She had almost exactly $10 left from the sale of the last of her winter preserves. She sat with that envelope in her hands for a long time. The lamp threw a warm circle on the table, and the rest of the room was dark and quiet. Outside, she could hear the frogs at the edge of the water, steady and low, the way they sang on nights when the air was soft. She thought about the neighbors leaning on her fence post. She thought about the banker's flat voice telling her that land with standing water was land losing value. She thought about every piece of advice she had been given and measured it against what she had read and what she had seen with her own eyes. Then she folded the envelope and put it in her apron pocket. She was up before the sun the next morning. The dew was still heavy on the grass near the barn, and the air smelled of wet earth and whatever green thing had started growing at the water's edge overnight. She pulled on her work boots without sitting down, the way she always did when her mind was already somewhere else, and she walked out to the flooded pasture before she even put the kettle on. The water was still. In the early light it looked silver, almost pale, like a mirror laid flat in the ground. She walked the perimeter slowly, the way she had done a dozen times by now. But this time she was not looking at it the way the neighbors looked at it. She was not measuring the loss. She was measuring the possibility. She counted her steps along the longer edge. She knelt at the shallow end where the ground sloped gently and pressed her fingers into the mud. Clay, firm and thick. She had known it was there, but she wanted to feel it again. Wanted to be sure her memory had not been kind to her. It had not. The clay was real. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the water for one long, quiet moment. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and ate a cold biscuit standing at the counter. And before the morning was half gone, she had hitched the old mule to the wagon and was on the road toward town. The feed store sat at the far end of the main road, past the grain elevator and the post office, in a low wooden building that always smelled of burlap and molasses and something faintly metallic she had never been able to name. The man behind the counter was older, heavy-set, with the kind of hands that had done real work for a long time. He looked up when she came in, but did not smile or frown, just waited. She told him what she wanted. She said it plainly, the way she had practiced saying it on the road over, without apology and without explanation. Fingerlings, she said, channel catfish and bluegill if he had them. She had $10. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. Then he scratched the back of his neck and said that $10 would get her close to 200 fingerlings if she was not particular about an exact count. He said he had a tank out back and that the stock was healthy. He did not ask her why she wanted them or what she planned to do with them. That was something she appreciated about him without saying so. She nodded once and set the $10 on the counter. He picked up the bills without counting them and tucked them into his shirt pocket and said to bring the wagon around to the side door. The fish came in 2 large metal buckets packed with water, covered with cloth to keep the splashing down on the ride home. She drove home slower than she had driven to town. The buckets sat in the back of the wagon, and she could hear the water sloshing in them with every rut in the road, and she kept her pace deliberate, turning wide on the corners, giving the wagon time to settle before she urged the horse forward again. It was late afternoon by the time the farm came into view, and the light had gone golden across the flooded pasture, turning the surface of the water from gray to something that looked almost warm. She climbed down from the wagon and did not go inside. She went straight to the back and lifted the cloth from the first bucket and looked in. They were small, so small they barely registered as fish at first. Just a flickering darkness in the water. Hundreds of tiny movements that made the surface shimmer. She stood there for a moment watching them, the way she sometimes watched something new on the farm before she decided what it needed from her. She carried the first bucket to the water's edge herself, walking carefully so as not to trip on the uneven ground where the grass had gone soft and sunken near the waterline. The pasture had settled into its new shape over the weeks since the rains, the edges clearly defined now, the water neither rising nor receding, fed somewhere below by something she still did not fully understand but trusted. She crouched at the edge and tilted the bucket slowly, letting the water from the bucket meet the water of the pasture in a thin stream first, giving the fish time to feel the change in temperature before the whole of it poured through. They entered the water so quietly it almost looked like nothing had happened. One moment the bucket held them, and the next moment the pasture did. She went back for the second bucket and did the same. She poured it slowly, watching the fingerlings disappear into the brown-green dark below the surface, watching the ripples spread and then smooth, watching the pasture absorb them the way it had absorbed the rain, completely and without ceremony. She straightened up and wiped her hands on her trousers and stood for a while at the edge of the water. The light was still gold but fading now, and somewhere behind her in the trees the evening birds had started. She thought about the $10. She thought about how much she did not have and how much she still needed, and how those 200 tiny fish were now the sum of everything she had spent on hope this season. She heard voices from the road before she saw them. Two of the neighboring men, passing on their way back from wherever the day had taken them, slowing their horses when they saw her standing at the edge of the flooded ground. One of them called out, asking her what she was doing down there by the water. She turned and told them plainly that she had just put fish in the pasture. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds before the laughing started. The laughing was not mean-spirited exactly. That was almost the harder part of it. It was the kind of laughing that comes from genuine disbelief. The way a person laughs when they see something so far outside the bounds of sensible behavior that their body does not know what else to do with it. One of the men took off his hat and pressed it to his chest like he was trying to hold himself together. The other one had to look away toward the tree line and collect himself before he could speak again. When he did speak, he asked her how much she had paid for them. She told him $10 for 200 fish. That set the first one off again. He said something to his companion that she did not fully catch over the sound of the laughter, but she heard the word ruined, and she heard the word mud, and she heard the phrase good money. And that was enough to understand the shape of what he thought. She did not argue with them. She stood with her arms at her sides and let them finish, and watched their faces the way she had been watching the water all afternoon. Quietly, with patience. She was not sure she actually felt, but had learned long ago to perform until it became real. One of them, when he had settled down enough to be serious, told her that she was going to lose those fish to the first dry week. He said the water would drop and the fish would die in the mud, and she would have spent $10 to feed the crows. He said it not unkindly, the way a person speaks when they believe they are saving someone from a mistake. they still have time to correct. He gestured at the flooded pasture like the evidence was self-evident and needed no further argument. She looked out at the water. The surface was still now, the last of the fingerling ripples long gone. The gold had left the light and the water had gone to a darker color, something between pewter and green, and it was very quiet out there and very wide, and in the fading evening it looked less like a ruined field and more like something that had always been meant to hold water. She told them she appreciated the concern. That was all she said. They exchanged a look with each other, the kind of look that two people share when they have mutually decided that a third person is beyond helping. And then they touched their hats and moved on down the road. She listened to the horses until the sound faded into the ordinary evening noise of crickets and wind, and the distant low call of something in the tree line she could not identify. Then she turned back to the water. The pond, if she was going to start calling it that, was about 3 acres by her best estimation. Maybe a little more in the low corner where the ground dipped toward the old drainage creek. She knelt at the edge and put her fingers in. The water was cold, colder than she expected for the time of year, and there was a faint smell to it, clean and a little dark, like creek water after a long rain. She worked her fingers into the soft mud at the edge and felt the way it gave, the way it held together in a different texture than the dry pasture soil she'd spent her whole life working. This was bottom mud, settled mud, the kind of mud that meant the water had found its level and intended to stay. She wiped her hand on her work pants and stood up slowly. 3 acres, maybe a little more. She walked the perimeter of it in the last of the daylight, not in any hurry, just measuring it with her steps the way her grandmother had taught her to measure anything worth knowing. 60 paces along the north edge, 40-something along the east where the ground rose toward the fence line, longer on the south side where the water had crept into the old drainage corridor and gone soft and marshy at the edges. She could feel the ground getting uncertain under her boots out there, half sponge and half mud, and she stepped carefully and noted where the cattail shoots were already beginning to push up through the dark water. Cattails meant something. She knew that much. They came where water was real, not just sitting on top of ground that couldn't hold it. They came where there was depth enough, and calm enough, and something underneath worth holding on to. She stood at the south edge for a while and watched a pair of red-winged blackbirds move through the reeds that hadn't been reeds 2 months ago. They moved like they owned it, like they had been waiting for exactly this. She thought about the fish. 200 fingerlings were somewhere under that darkening surface right now. She could not see them. She could not hear them. She had no way of knowing if they had survived the afternoon, if the water was right for them, if there was enough in the pond to eat. She had asked the man at the hatchery what they needed, and he had told her clean water, still water, and time. He had not sounded worried. He had looked at her like a man who had seen many kinds of farmers and had decided she was the kind who would either fail quietly or succeed quietly, and either way would not complain. She hoped he was right. The evening was fully on her now, and the pond had gone the color of dark ink under a sky still pale at the edges. The frogs had started somewhere in the cattails, and the sound of them was so thick and confident, it felt almost like a reassurance. Like the land was speaking in a language she only partly understood, but was beginning to learn. She had planted the fish the way she had once watched her grandmother plant garlic in October. with no ceremony, no guarantee, just the steady belief that what you put into the ground in faith could come back to you in time. The first week passed the way all uncertain weeks do, slowly, with too much quiet in the hours she was trying not to think about the pond, and too much noise in the hours she was supposed to be sleeping. She went out each morning before the mist had lifted, standing at the edge of the water with her boots sinking slightly into the soft margin where the grass gave way to mud. She was not sure what she expected to see. The fish were small and the pond was wide, and brown things moved under the surface in ways that could have been anything. Current from wind, shadows of clouds, the pull of water settling over uneven ground. She watched anyway. It cost her nothing to watch. Her neighbor came by on the fourth morning. He leaned on the fence post the way he always did, with his arms crossed over the top rail and his hat pushed back like a man who has decided something before he has finished looking at it. He studied the water for a long moment without speaking, and she did not speak either, because she had learned that silence sometimes made people say more honest things than conversation. Finally, he said it looked like a mud hole to him. He said he had drained worse fields than this in a single afternoon and had put winter wheat in by the following week. He said she was losing the season. He was not mean about it, which was almost harder to bear than if he had been, because meanness could be dismissed, but plain concern had a way of sitting in the chest longer. She thanked him for stopping by. He looked at her the way older men sometimes look at younger women who have made a quiet decision they cannot understand, which is a look halfway between pity and the beginning of a grudging curiosity. He pushed off the fence and walked back across the road, and she turned back to the pond and did not let herself think about what he had said for the rest of the morning. But that night she sat at the table and went over her numbers again by lamplight, a habit she had developed the way some people develop a habit of checking the sky for weather. Not because she could change anything, but because looking at the truth clearly was better than letting it surprise her. She had 2 months of flour in the root cellar, enough dried beans, and the egg money from the hens was covering her smallest bill. She was not comfortable, but she was not failing yet. She had learned to know the difference. She wrote in the small notebook she kept for farm records. Water still clear, no sign of loss. Frogs very loud at dusk. It was not much of an entry, but she wrote it carefully, the same way she wrote everything in that notebook, because she believed that small facts recorded honestly were worth more than big hopes written in a hurry. Outside, the pond sat quiet in the dark, holding whatever it held. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does when winter has been long enough to make people forget what warmth feels like. The mornings stayed cold well into the 3rd month, the ground staying hard longer than usual along the fence lines and near the old barn. But on the water, spring announced itself plainly. The pond, which had sat dark and still through the coldest weeks, began to show signs of life that she had been watching for without knowing exactly when they would come. The frogs were the first clear signal. They had been calling since late winter, but now their sound at dusk filled the whole far end of the pasture like something that had been held back and could no longer wait. She walked the bank one evening and counted more than she expected. Not the frogs themselves, which moved too fast, but the rings they left where they dove from the grass into the water. The pond edge was alive in a way that it had not been even the previous fall. Then came the insects, hovering in low clouds above the surface on warm afternoons. She did not mind them. She had read enough in the old agricultural pamphlets her neighbor had let her borrow over winter that she knew what insects over pond water meant. The fish were feeding, and feeding fish were growing fish. She waited 2 more weeks before she did what she had been planning since the cold broke. She waded in at the shallow end one morning with a wide mesh net she had repaired over the winter, working the holes closed with heavy thread by lamplight over several evenings. The net was not pretty, but it held. She drew it slowly through the water in a wide arc and brought it in, and what she found made her stop completely still for a moment. The fish were not the thin, barely formed creatures she had released the previous year. They were solid and fat, the length of her hand and longer, moving hard against the mesh. She counted what was in the net, released them back carefully, and stood in the shallow water for a long moment without moving. The numbers told her something she had not quite let herself believe until she saw it plainly. She carried the net back to the bank and sat down in the grass with her boots still wet and thought about what those fish represented, not in hopeful terms, but in practical ones. There were enough to sell, not just enough to feed herself through the season, enough to sell and to sell at a price that would change what the next year looked like. She had not told anyone what she was planning to do with them. She had not told the man across the road, or the women at the feed store, or anyone who passed the pond on the county road and stopped to look. She had kept it close, the way you keep something you are not ready to share. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. She was not a woman who made elaborate plans on paper, but this felt like something that needed to be written down rather than kept only in her head. She wrote down the count from the net, applied what she knew about how fish multiplied and how much of the pond she had not yet sampled, and came to a number that made her set the pencil down and look at the wall for a moment. The next morning she drove into town before the feed store opened and went instead to the small market 2 streets back from the main road, the one that sold fresh meat and eggs and whatever local farmers brought in season. She had been there before with eggs, with dried herbs, with the occasional extra squash or bundle of dried corn. The man who ran it knew her face, though not well. She told him she had fish. He asked what kind and how many. She told him. He asked how fresh. She told him they were still in the water, that she could bring them any morning he needed them, that they were fat and clean and raised in clear water on a flooded pasture with no chemicals and no crowding. He looked at her for a moment, the way people had been looking at her for the better part of a year, with a measuring kind of skepticism. Then he asked what she was asking per pound. She told him. He was quiet. He said he had a restaurant buyer who came through twice a month, and that fresh local fish was something the man had asked him about more than once, and he had never had a reliable source for it. He said he could not promise anything until he saw what she brought, but that she should come back in 2 days with a sample haul, cleaned and weighed, and they would talk from there. She drove home with the windows down even though the morning was cool. She was not celebrating. She was thinking through the practical side of what came next. The right nets, the right timing, how to keep the fish cool between the pond and town, how much she could harvest without pulling the population down too far, how to keep the balance she had worked to build. That was the part people who laughed at the pond had never understood. She had not just let water sit and hoped for the best. She had watched it, managed it, made decisions about it every single week since the day she released 200 fingerlings into a field everyone else called ruined. The pond had given her something real. Now the question was how to receive it carefully, without taking more than it could give, and without letting the moment rush her into carelessness. She had not come this far by being careless. 2 days later, she was up before the sun. She had spent the evening before preparing everything she would need. The long-handled net she had repaired with a length of cord bought at the feed store, the wooden crate lined with damp burlap to keep the fish cool, the small scale she had borrowed from a neighbor without explaining why. She had also walked the edge of the pond in the last light of the afternoon, watching where the fish moved heaviest near the surface, marking in her mind where she would cast first. The morning air was cold and still. Her boots left dark prints in the wet grass as she crossed the pasture. The pond lay flat and silver under a sky just beginning to lighten, and when she stopped at the edge and looked across it, she felt the same quiet thing she had felt the first time she ever stood here and decided not to drain it. Something steady, something that had been earned slowly. She worked for 2 hours. She was not greedy about it. She moved the net carefully, watching the weight before she lifted each cast, releasing what was too small or too young, and keeping only what had grown to a proper size. By the time the sun was fully over the eastern tree line, she had a crate of cleaned, weighed fish that sat just above 30 pounds. It was not a massive haul, but it was clean, consistent, and the fish were in good condition. She had taken care to make sure of that. She drove to town with the crate in the back, packed in ice she had chipped from a block that morning. She did not hurry. She kept the truck steady on the county road and thought about what she would say and what she would not say. She would not talk about the flood or the neighbors or the $10. None of that was the buyer's concern. What mattered to him was what was in the crate, and she trusted what was in the crate. He looked over the fish carefully, the way a man does when he is trying to find a reason to offer less. He checked the size, the color, the way they had been cleaned. He weighed them himself on a separate scale. Then he stood up straight and looked at her for a moment, without saying anything, the way people do when they are recalculating something in their mind. He named a price. She did not flinch, and she did not accept immediately. She asked a single quiet question about the volume he could take on a regular basis, because she was not interested in a one-time arrangement. She was interested in something steady. He looked at her again, nodded slowly, and said that depended on whether she could deliver this same quality consistently. She told him she could. He said they had a deal then and put out his hand. She shook his hand. The drive home felt different from any drive she had taken in a long time. The wagon was lighter without the crates, and the road seemed easier somehow, the ruts less deep, the sky less heavy. She did not feel triumphant in any loud way. It was quieter than that. It felt more like the way a held breath finally releases, slow and complete, leaving a person more settled than they were before. When she got back to the farm, she unhitched the horse and gave him water and a measure of grain. She walked down to the pond in the late afternoon light. The surface was calm. The reeds along the north edge had grown thicker through the summer, and the water near the center held that clean, dark color she had learned to trust. A few rings appeared near the shallows where something moved beneath. She stood there for a while without moving, her hands in her coat pockets, watching the water do what water does. She thought about the $10. She thought about standing at the edge of that flooded field in the spring mud, holding a tin bucket with 200 tiny fish inside it, while voices carried over the fence and the laughter was not even unkind, just certain. They had been certain the way people are when something looks foolish from the outside. She had not been certain. She had only been willing. That was the difference, she thought. Not that she had known more than them. She had simply been willing to stay with a thing long enough to find out what it was. She went inside and made a simple supper. She sat at the table where she had done the sums so many times with so little to work from, and she wrote down the numbers from today, what had been paid and what had been agreed to going forward. The figures were plain and honest, and they were enough. More than enough to carry the farm through winter, more than enough to carry it into the next season, and the one after that. Before she slept, she sat by the window for a few minutes in the dark. The pond was invisible out there, but she knew exactly where it was. She knew its edges and its depth and its moods in different weather. She had learned it the way you learn something you have chosen to care for, slowly and without shortcuts. Outside, the night was quiet. The farm was quiet. The water was out there doing what it had always done, holding life in it, patient and unhurried and full. She had bought 200 tiny fish for $10 when she had almost nothing left. The farm had given it all back to her, and then some. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not lie awake, worrying about a single thing.